April 10th, 1994. Arlington, Virginia. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children receives an anonymous call on their tip line from a man who has information on 3 missing females: 14-year-old Beth Miller, 20-year-old Tiffany Sessions, and 17-year-old Tracy Kroh. Even though all 3 women disappeared from different states at different times, the caller claims that he has seen them all together and that they are being held against their will in a prostitution ring in Texas. An extensive investigation uncovers no evidence that this story is true, but even though all 3 cases have had potential suspects, none of the 3 missing women have ever been found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today I will be doing something a little different by covering not 1, not 2, but 3 missing persons cases. The disappearances of Beth Miller, Tiffany Sessions, and Tracy Kroh. Now these are 3 young women who went missing at different times in 3 different states, so you might be wondering how they're connected. Well, in 1994, the authorities received an anonymous tip that all 3 women were still alive and being held captive in a prostitution ring together. It's very likely this tip was nothing more than a hoax, but if it was, it may be the most bizarre false tip I've ever seen in a missing persons investigation. This whole episode was set in motion when I recently received a request from a listener named Duncan, who suggested I cover the disappearance of Tracy Kroh on the podcast. I soon decided that this anonymous tip angle would be a good opportunity to not only feature Tracy's case, but cover the disappearances of Tiffany Sessions and Beth Miller as well. Yes, I seriously doubt that these 3 cases are actually connected, but they're all still technically unsolved, and none of the victims have been found, so I felt this episode could shine a spotlight on all of them. Since Beth's disappearance was the first one to take place chronologically, I shall start off by covering her case, before I discuss the disappearances of Tiffany and Tracy. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is finally on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearances of Beth Miller, Tiffany Sessions, and Tracy Kroh. Our story begins in 1983 in Idaho Springs, Colorado, a small mountain mining town of around 2,800 people located in Clear Creek County. Our first central figure is 14-year-old Elizabeth Ann Miller, who goes by the name Beth. Beth is a high school freshman and the middle child in a family of 7 children. At around 10 a.m. on the morning of August 16th, Beth left her home to go jogging. She usually went jogging alongside her younger sister Lisa, but on this particular day, Lisa felt like sleeping in, so Beth went out alone. When she missed a babysitting job she was scheduled for that afternoon and did not return home for dinner with her family, they immediately began searching for her and eventually reported her missing. Since Beth did not have any personal belongings on her at the time and left behind money she had earned from babysitting, it seemed very unlikely that she took off voluntarily. An extensive search would be performed of the area by law enforcement and volunteers, and a number of abandoned mine shafts would be checked. There was a lot of concern because Beth had told her family that it wasn't uncommon for her to notice people following her while she was jogging, and she recently had an unpleasant run-in with an older man. According to witnesses, A few days before Beth went missing, they'd seen a man in a faded red Ford Courier pickup truck flirting with her. The man became angry when Beth ended their conversation and took off. He was described as being pale-skinned and in his 30s, with light brown collar-length hair and prescription eyeglasses with blue-tinted photo-grade lenses, and he apparently said his name was Claude. His red pickup truck was described as having a white camper shell and out-of-state license plates. Only a few weeks after Beth went missing, a fisherman reported having seen a suspicious man inside a red pickup truck matching that description near the Pablo Dam, located nearly 150 miles southeast of Idaho Springs. The man had a young girl inside the truck with him who looked scared. In December, there would be another suspicious sighting of this red Ford Courier pickup truck at a gas station in Fort Morgan. By this point, over 30,000 missing reward posters for Beth were being circulated throughout the country, and this gas station had a stack containing 100 of them. A man matching the description of the suspect seen talking to Beth entered the station and noticed the posters before he suddenly grabbed the entire stack and fled the scene. The attendant was able to take down the license number from the man's truck, but it turned out to be a match for a license plate from Denver, which had been canceled. Some potential persons of interest would pop up on the radar. In May of 1984, 18-year-old Robert Arnold Storm fatally shot a 17-year-old co-worker of his named Shauna Webb in Colorado Springs. Storm would be linked to Beth's disappearance after a strange message with his signature was found scrawled on a metal partition at a car wash. It was addressed to quote-unquote pigmen, aka the police, and made reference to Shauna Webb's murder, but it also mentioned Beth Miller and stated that her body was buried near a King Superstore and a Safeway store, though it never specified which city. Well, Storm denied writing the message, though he did say he knew another girl named Beth Miller. Police never officially called Storm a suspect, though they said they would not rule him out either. Another person of interest was James Albert Garcia, who was charged with attempted murder after strangling a 17-year-old girl he picked up hitchhiking in April of 1985. What was interesting about Garcia is that he was a former deputy for the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office, which is where Beth's mother worked as a clerk. Garcia could also be placed in Idaho Springs on the day Beth went missing, but ultimately, no evidence linked him to her disappearance. Another bizarre turn of events took place in 1985 when a young girl was picked up in Tampa, Florida, who claimed she was Beth Miller. She had a telephone conversation with Beth's parents, who became convinced she was their daughter, but once they flew to Tampa and had a face-to-face meeting with the girl, they concluded that she wasn't Beth, and a comparison of her teeth to Beth's dental charts confirmed this fact. Incidentally, before the girl was positively identified, she escaped from police custody. It was suspected she might have been a teen runaway from California, but I have no idea if they tracked her down again, so you could almost consider this an intriguing mystery within a mystery. Anyway, the most promising lead occurred in 1993, when a suspect named Edward Apodaca was implicated in Beth's disappearance. 3 years earlier, Apodaca was shot to death at his home in Albuquerque, and both his wife and his mother-in-law were charged with murdering him for his insurance money. But while Apodaca himself had never officially been charged with any crimes, he was alleged to be violent and abusive towards women. He supposedly raped his wife before he married her, and had been implicated in the sexual assault of another young girl during the 1980s. Apodaca was placed in Denver, only 30 miles east of Idaho Springs, on August 15, 1983, the day before Beth disappeared. A witness had also reportedly seen Beth speaking with Apodaca inside a red pickup with a white camper shell 3 days before she went missing. At one point, Apodaca allegedly confessed to Beth's murder to a Denver police officer, and over the years, rumors circulated that Apodaca's girlfriend at that time had told people she was with him when he disposed of Beth's body. After receiving an anonymous tip in 1993, police finally decided to question the woman, and after she failed a lie detector test, she confessed that she had driven Apodaca to a remote spot in the mountains near Idaho Springs. While she waited inside his pickup truck, Apodaca went off to bury Beth's body, and she later helped him dispose of a bloody mattress. The former girlfriend led police to this area, and cadaver dogs would detect the presence of human remains at a spot near a pine tree. However, when the spot was excavated, nothing was found, and they were unable to uncover any evidence to corroborate the woman's story. The following year, Beth's family had her legally declared dead, but it was around the same time period when the investigation would be led into a very unexpected direction. On April 10, 1994, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, aka the NCMEC, received a tip on their hotline from an anonymous male caller who claimed that he had seen Beth Miller alive the previous day. Not only that, but he claimed Beth was alongside two other missing young women, 20-year-old Tiffany Sessions and 17-year-old Tracy Kroh, who had both vanished in 1989. According to the caller, he had seen the three women together at a motel in Austin, Texas, and they were all being held against their will in a prostitution ring. He said they were with a man named Thomas Stewart, another man known only as Raymond, and a woman who was not identified. This group was apparently traveling around together in two separate vans, one of which was white and had Florida tags, and the other of which was a bluish-gray color. Well, needless to say, this tip completely baffled investigators, as not only had Tiffany Sessions and Tracy Kroh gone missing years after Beth Miller did, but all three victims hailed from different states: Beth from Colorado, Tiffany from Florida, and Tracy from Pennsylvania. There didn't seem to be any discernible connection between the three cases, but regardless, a national alert was sent out, and law enforcement agencies from Colorado, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Texas all collaborated together to investigate this lead. So I guess now would be a good time to discuss the disappearances of the other two missing women. In 1989, Tiffany Sessions was a 20-year-old junior who was majoring in finance at the University of Florida in Gainesville and shared a condo with her roommate at the Casablanca East condominiums. At around 4:45 p.m. on February 9th, Tiffany told her roommate she was going for a power walk along Williston Road. After leaving the condo, she never returned and was eventually reported missing. It seemed very unlikely that Tiffany took off on her own, as she left her wallet, keys, and identification behind. According to Tiffany's roommate, she also took off all her jewelry before heading out, but left on a Rolex wristwatch her father had given her, saying, "If somebody comes after me, they'll have to fight me for the watch." The watch had a unique serial number on it which was flagged by the Rolex company on the chance that someone attempted to pawn or sell it, but nothing turned up. Tiffany's disappearance would eventually become the largest missing persons investigation in the history of Florida. The third victim mentioned in the phone call, Tracy Kroh, went missing 6 months after Tiffany did, and this occurred in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania. Tracy lived with her parents and younger sister in the rural community of Enterline and was about to start her senior year of high school. She was considered an excellent straight-A student and was a member of the National Honor Society. On the afternoon of August 5th, Tracy climbed into her 1971 Mercury Comet and went to visit her older sister Tammy, who lived with her husband 7 miles away at the Alex Acres Trailer Park. Tracy was planning to return a barbecue grill to Tammy, but discovered she was not home, so she left the grill, along with some grocery store coupons, on the front steps before leaving. The following morning, Tracy's parents awoke to discover that she was not at home, but they were not immediately concerned, since it was not uncommon for Tracy to spend the night at her sister's place, so they just assumed that's where she was. However, when Tracy did not return by that evening, and her parents learned that Tammy never saw her the previous day, her father went to look for her. He drove to the nearby town of Millersburg and soon discovered Tracy's Mercury Comet in the town square. The vehicle was locked, but Tracy's belongings were not inside, and there was no sign of her, so she was reported missing to the police. It would turn out that at least 15 witnesses had interacted with Tracy in the town square the previous night, and ironically enough, the last place she was seen was right across the street from the police station. There were also reports that she had been seen talking to a local young man by the Susquehanna River, which borders the west side of Millersburg, and it turned out that she used a payphone shortly before she disappeared. It was suspected that she was planning to go see a friend who lived a short distance away from the town square, though this could never be confirmed. It seemed very unlikely that Tracy would have run away on her own, as she had no history of causing trouble, and left behind $300 in cash in her bedroom and $400 in her bank account. In December of 1993, a farmer would discover some items from Tracy's wallet, including her driver's license and National Honor Society card, in an area alongside Wickanisco Creek, located off Rakers Mill Road, 9 miles outside of Millersburg. And of course, it would only be 4 months later when Tracy's name would be mentioned in the phone call to the NCMEC. Anyway, even though there seemed to be no discernible connection between the disappearances of Beth, Tiffany, and Tracy, an extensive investigation was performed into the story from the anonymous tipster. In the end, they found no evidence to support the caller's claims that the 3 victims were being held captive in a prostitution ring by a man named Thomas Stewart, or that this Thomas Stewart even existed. The call was likely nothing more than a bizarre hoax, but there would be further developments in all 3 cases. So let's get back to Beth Miller's case. In 1997, another potential person of interest popped up on the radar when a man named James Parton was arrested in Columbus, Ohio on child pornography charges. It turned out that Parton had lived in Beth's neighborhood at the time she went missing, and a newspaper clipping about her case, along with a map of Clear Creek County with 3 X's drawn on it, were found in his home. Parton was also briefly investigated as a possible suspect in the JonBenet Ramsey murder, since he had a photograph of JonBenet and some news clippings about the case in his possession as well, but he was eventually ruled out, and there was no conclusive evidence to link him to Beth's disappearance. However, in 2006, a grand jury was convened after the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office identified a 61-year-old suspect named Viola Moya, who was a former girlfriend of Edward Apodaca. It was alleged that Moya was driving Apodaca's truck while he assaulted and murdered Beth in the back before disposing of her body. She had apparently confessed her involvement to 2 different police departments during the mid-1980s before she recanted her story and failed at least 1 polygraph test. Moya denied all these allegations and claimed to know nothing at all about Beth Miller. One of the people who believed Moya was involved was Beth's own sister, Lynn Granger, who was inspired to get into law enforcement because of Beth's disappearance, joining the Idaho Springs Police Department and personally investigating the case during the early 1990s. But in the end, the grand jury investigation ruled that there was insufficient evidence to indict anyone in connection to Beth's disappearance, and actually issued a scathing report against law enforcement. They accused them of a quote-unquote clear lack of professionalism, claiming that jurisdictional disputes between the Idaho Springs Police, the Clear Creek Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation hampered the original investigation, causing many key documents and statements from the case to be lost, destroyed, or difficult to corroborate. Ever since then, the investigation into Beth's disappearance has pretty much hit a standstill. So now let's move on to Tracy Kroh's case, as there have been a few new developments in recent years. In 2014, a woman came forward and told police that in the months prior to Tracy's disappearance, a man had attempted to grab her from behind while she was walking through the town square in Millersburg, but she managed to escape unharmed. While she was unable to provide a detailed description of the man, the woman said she looked similar to Tracy at that time, and since Tracy's car was found in that same town square after she went missing, she thought there might be some connection. In 2016, police announced they were investigating a new lead after receiving a tip which implicated a man. At the time Tracy went missing, he had connections to a piece of property in Dauphin County, but even though a search was performed, nothing was found. This man was interviewed by police, and they stated that he has not been ruled out as a suspect. Tracy's disappearance continues to remain unsolved, but Tiffany Sessions' case, it has come tantalizingly close to a complete resolution. Over the years, there would be thousands of potential leads, the majority of which had a dead end. One of the most promising was a letter sent by an anonymous prison inmate who claimed that he'd heard a convicted murderer and rapist named Michael Knickerbocker brag about the abduction and murder of Tiffany Sessions. He seemed like an intriguing suspect, but it turned out that the anonymous inmate who wrote the letter was actually Knickerbocker himself. However, when another convicted criminal named Paul Rowles died of cancer in 2013, the investigation would soon uncover a very strong connection between him and Tiffany. Rowles first went to prison for the 1972 rape and murder of his next-door neighbor, Linda Fida. He received a life sentence for the crime, but after completing a sex offenders program behind bars, Rowles was paroled in 1985. He wound up going back to prison 9 years later, after kidnapping a 15-year-old girl from her family's apartment in Clearwater and sexually assaulting her before she managed to escape. Since he had revoked his parole, this ensured Rowles would remain locked up for the rest of his life. Well, in 2012, DNA testing would link Rowles to an unsolved murder. 20 years earlier, a 21-year-old New Jersey woman named Elizabeth Foster was attending Santa Fe College in Gainesville when she suddenly went missing. On May 27, 1992, 11 days after she was last seen, her body was discovered in a shallow grave in a 10-acre wooded field. She had been raped and badly beaten before she was murdered. Well, this location just happened to be about a mile away from where Tiffany Sessions disappeared, so investigators started looking into a possible connection. It turned out that Rowles did live in Gainesville in 1989, and one of his jobs involved delivering scaffolding to a construction site which happened to be along Tiffany's jogging path. He also had a second job as a pizza delivery driver, but did not show up for work on the day Tiffany went missing. Investigators wanted to question Rowles about Tiffany's disappearance, but by this point, he was so ravaged by cancer that he could not say much, and he soon fell into a coma and passed away. But Rowles' death would allow for the discovery of a crucial piece of evidence. An address book was found inside a box of his belongings, which contained cryptic references to his other crimes and the names of his other known victims: Linda Fida, Elizabeth Foster, and the 15-year-old girl he had abducted from Clearwater. While the book did not contain any specific mention of Tiffany Sessions, there were a series of numbers written down which really stood out. 2989. Well, February 9th, 1989 happened to be the date Tiffany went missing. These numbers were also accompanied by notations with the number 2, and after Linda Fida, Tiffany would have been Rowles' second murder victim. According to the teenage victim from Clearwater, while she was in his vehicle, Rowles briefly stopped at a wooded field near Gainesville, which was believed to be the same location where Elizabeth Foster's body was buried. Rowles told her, quote, "This is the kind of place people dump things they don't want to be found." This made investigators suspect that Tiffany's remains might also have been buried in this same area, but thus far, all searches of the field have come up empty. Officially, all 3 of these missing persons cases remain unsolved, as neither Tiffany Sessions, Tracy Kroh, or Beth Miller have ever been found. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Well, before I talk about each individual case, I should address the main reason I decided to feature all 3 of them in the same episode, and that's the anonymous phone tip to the NCMEC hotline in 1994, which claimed that each of these 3 missing women were being held against their will in a prostitution ring. Now, I'll state right from the outset that I don't believe the tip was genuine at all, and investigators eventually reached the same conclusion. It seems the anonymous male caller was perpetuating some sort of hoax, but I gotta say, it has to be one of the most bizarre hoaxes I've ever seen in a criminal investigation. I mean, I'm sure that virtually all missing persons cases have their fair share of fake tips, but this particular tip involved 3 separate missing women from 3 different states who had no known connection to each other. And this was in 1994, when the internet was still in its infancy, so it's not like you could just visit the Charlie Project and pick 3 unsolved missing persons cases at random to make a prank phone call. Back then, it would have taken extra work just to learn about all 3 of these disappearances, so why did the caller decide to group these particular ones together? Out of the 3, Tiffany Sessions' case was definitely the one which got the most national exposure, but Beth Miller and Tracy Kroh's cases were a lot more obscure. And what was the significance of claiming they were being held together in a prostitution ring in Austin, Texas, a location which doesn't have a connection to any of these stories? And is there a reason why the caller fingered a man named Thomas Stewart as being their captor? This is reminiscent of my episode about the El Dorado Jane Doe, where her killer shared a story about the victim growing up in a prostitution ring with the missing girls from the Fort Worth 3 case. Again, that particular story was probably completely untrue as well, but it's just so random. I'm not going to waste any more time analyzing this false tip, But I'd be lying if I said I didn't want to find out who the anonymous caller was and learn what was going on in their mind which compelled them to fabricate this story and select these 3 particular cases. I guess the most logical explanation is that the caller may have been responsible for the disappearance of only one of these women, but decided to lump the victim together with 2 other missing women in order to concoct a fake story and cause confusion in the investigation. Whatever the case, let's move on and try to figure out what really did happen to Beth Miller, Tiffany Sessions, and Tracy Kroh. Well, I'm going to start off with Tiffany Sessions' disappearance because other than the fact that her remains have never been found, I pretty much consider that case to be solved. I am totally convinced that Paul Rowles is her killer, as there's some pretty strong circumstantial evidence he was responsible. He lived in Gainesville at the time she went missing, he delivered to a construction site on Tiffany's jogging route, and he abducted and murdered another college student from Gainesville 3 years later. Of course, the biggest piece of evidence is Rowles' address book, as the numbers 2989 perfectly correspond with the date of Tiffany's disappearance, and I think it's likely that the notation number 2 was intended to represent her being his second victim. I don't know if this would be enough evidence to convict someone in a court of law, but it's pretty compelling. When you couple in the story from Rowles' surviving victim about how he bragged about dumping things in a remote wooded area, which may have been the same location where he buried Elizabeth Foster's body, I think there's a good chance that Tiffany's remains are there as well, but they've just been unable to find her. If they don't recover Tiffany's remains, the one thing which could potentially connect Rowles to her disappearance is the Rolex watch she was wearing when she left the condo. The serial number on the watch was flagged in the event someone tried to sell or pawn it. If Tiffany was buried with her watch still on, then that won't mean anything, but if that serial number turns up in circulation someday, and the watch can be traced back to Rowles, then that's conclusive evidence which links him to the crime. It's always tough when deceased criminals are believed to be responsible for a victim's disappearance, but they are no longer around to reveal where their remains are. This case is especially frustrating because Rowles had already received a life sentence for murdering Linda Fida and should never have been free to harm his other victims to begin with, but it sounds like issues with prison overcrowding at that time was one of the factors which led to him being paroled. If Rowles murdered Tiffany, he never faced justice for it, but it sounds like he died a pretty painful, protracted death from cancer, so I guess karma did ultimately get him in the end. Until I see strong evidence pointing to another suspect, I am pretty comfortable with the conclusion that Paul Rowles was the guilty party here. Now, the disappearances of Tracy Kroh and Beth Miller, those cases aren't so cut and dried. Sadly, it seems very likely that both victims were murdered, but unlike Tiffany's case, it's not entirely clear who was responsible, though there have been potential suspects. So we'll move on to discussing Tracy Kroh. One individual who has been pushed as a possible suspect is a name which has become fairly infamous in true crime circles, Larry Dwayne Hall. If you heard the minisode I released last year about the disappearance of Angela Hammond, you might already be familiar with him, but here's a quick refresher. Hall is currently serving a life sentence for the 1993 kidnapping and death of a teenage girl named Jessica Roach. While Hall has never officially been tied to any other murders, some people believe he is a serial killer who could be responsible for the disappearances and deaths of as many as 40 women, including Angela Hammond and the 3 missing victims from the Springfield 3 case. Now, given that Hall sometimes traveled through Pennsylvania, Tracy Kroh has been placed on a list of missing females who could have been his potential victims, though there's no actual evidence that he was responsible or that he was anywhere near Millersburg at the time Tracy went missing. But I can't help but notice the interesting parallels between Tracy's disappearance and the Angela Hammond case. As you recall, Angela went missing from the small town of Clint, Missouri, after she stopped to call her boyfriend from a payphone in the town square. She was telling her boyfriend about a creepy-looking bearded man in a pickup truck before this guy suddenly abducted her from the phone booth and fled the area. Well, like Angela, Tracy Kroh was last seen in the town square of a small rural community and was apparently using a payphone shortly before she disappeared. Of course, there may not be any significance to this at all, especially since we don't even know if Larry Dwayne Hall was Angela's abductor, but there are some interesting parallels, especially since another woman came forward in recent years and claimed that a man tried to grab her while she was at the Millersburg Town Square in the months prior to Tracy's disappearance. However, while it's certainly possible that Tracy was abducted by a random predator just passing through the area, it seems there are a lot of rumors that someone who lived there and knew Tracy was responsible for her disappearance. The most recent development in this case was when investigators received a tip which implicated a Dauphin County man and compelled him to perform a search of a piece of property he was connected to in 1989, though nothing was ultimately found. Now, if you do an online search about Tracy, you will find a thread about her case in the Topics forum, which dates all the way back to 2007 and is a whopping 248 pages long. Needless to say, it contains a lot of unverified rumors about who was responsible for Tracy's disappearance, but since topic threads have never been known for being a paragon of accuracy, I'm not going to repeat any of this information on the podcast, especially since law enforcement have never publicly named any suspects. But if you look up Tracy's profile page at the Charlie Project, it mentions how a lot of the police's investigation was focused on her boyfriend, whom she may have been planning to see on the night she went missing. Well, from what I've read online, this person was technically not Tracy's boyfriend, but rather just a boy she was interested in, and it sounds like this might be the same boy she was seen talking with by the Susquehanna River on the night she went missing. Whatever the case, this boy's family has always denied any involvement in her disappearance. To me, I think one of the strangest aspects of this case is the discovery of Tracy's driver's license and National Honor Society card at a nearby creek 4 whole years after she went missing. I know it was a remote area, but it's still a bit surprising to me that it would be that long before anyone discovered it. It's possible the items were there the entire time, but what if someone decided to hold on to them for a few years before planting them at that location? If that's the case, then this would point to the perpetrator being someone local who lived in the area. Overall, I think I'd probably lean towards a local resident being responsible for Tracy's disappearance rather than a random stranger, but without knowing more information about the veracity of some of the rumors in this case, I can't come to a definitive conclusion. Either way, it sounds like the authorities have not given up on the investigation, as new leads have come in these past few years, and they are still actively searching for her. So let's hope they are successful one day, and are able to recover Tracy's remains, and find enough evidence to bring whoever was responsible to justice. So anyway, we shall close things out by examining Beth Miller's disappearance, which seems to be the most convoluted out of all these cases. Over the past 35 years, multiple people have been named as potential suspects, but there's a major wildcard in this case. We have the report of Beth having an encounter with a man in a red pickup truck with a white camper shell a few days before she went missing, in which he was flirting with her, and apparently became angry because she didn't want to talk to him. However, because the incident did not take place on the same day as Beth's disappearance, we cannot be 100% certain that this guy, who apparently called himself Claude, was responsible. On the surface, Claude certainly does seem like a promising suspect. There were eyewitness sightings of Beth with a man inside a truck matching this description both before and after she went missing. And we have the strange incident which took place 4 months later, where a man matching Claude's description driving a red pickup truck stole a stack of Beth's missing posters from a gas station and took off. But how well does Claude match the description of the people who have been considered potential suspects? As you recall, he was described as being in his 30s, having collar-length brown hair, and wearing prescription eyeglasses. I have never seen any photographs of Robert James Storn or James Albert Garcia, who were looked at as potential suspects during the mid-1980s, so I have no idea what they look like. They both popped up on the radar because they displayed violence towards a teenage victim and had tentative connections to Beth. Storm allegedly wrote a message which mentioned a burial location for Beth Miller's body, and Garcia was a former deputy at the same sheriff's office where Beth's mother worked as a clerk. Well, Storm was only 18 years old when he was arrested for murder, so I highly doubt he was Claude. Storm always denied writing the message with Beth's name, but even if he did write it, he lived in Colorado Springs, which is 100 miles away from Idaho Springs, so as far as I can tell, there's nothing placing him in the area at the time Beth went missing. Perhaps Storm simply read about Beth's case in the paper and decided to mention her name as a prank, or he really was referring to another girl he knew named Beth Miller. I haven't seen any follow-up on Storm since 1984, so obviously, they never found any evidence he was involved. Garcia is a bit more compelling as a suspect, since he does have a minor connection to Beth's family, and could actually be placed in Idaho Springs on the day she vanished, but again, there's no evidence to implicate him, and there's been no follow-up on him for decades. But what about James Parton, the suspect who was arrested on child pornography charges 14 years later? He lived in Beth's neighborhood in 1983, and had newspaper clippings about his disappearance in his home, along with a map with 3 X's marked on it. And unlike Storm and Garcia, I have seen a photograph of Parton, and he does wear glasses like Claude did. However, he would have been 21 years old in 1983, while Claude was described as being in his 30s. I see no indication that Parton was driving a red pickup truck at that time, but I think one of the key details about that truck is that it apparently had out-of-state plates. If Parton lived in the area, why would his vehicle have license plates for another state? While it might seem strange on the surface that Parton would have material related to Beth's disappearance 14 years after the fact, it's possible he simply developed a fascination with the case because it occurred near where he was living at that time. If you heard the episode I released last month about the disappearance of Michael Dunahee, you might recall me discussing an individual named Vernon Seitz, who was discovered to have material related to Michael's case and a lot of other missing children's cases in his home after he died. Like Parton, Seitz was also a creepy individual who had child pornography in his possession, so you can jump to a lot of conclusions, but they never did turn up any evidence that Seitz murdered anyone. The same thing applies to Parton. He's definitely a disturbed person, but he may have an obsession with unsolved cold cases involving children, even though he's never actually killed anyone. I mean, the guy was looked at as a potential suspect in the murder of JonBenet Ramsey because he had a lot of material related to her case, but prior to Parton's arrest, JonBenet's case had been one of the country's biggest news stories, so I hardly think a photo and news clippings about her is evidence that he was involved. Perhaps the map Parton had of Clear Creek County was him marking down his own guesses of possible burial locations for Beth, even though he had no involvement in her disappearance. Much like with Storm and Garcia, the links between Parton and this case are tentative at best. Of course, the most promising suspect is undoubtedly Edward Apodaca, as Beth's own family have openly expressed their belief that he was involved. Much like with Paul Rowles in the Tiffany Sessions case, Apodaca did not appear on the radar as a suspect until after he was already dead, so it's frustrating to think he could have buried Beth's remains somewhere, but is no longer around to reveal the location. Unlike the other suspects I've discussed, Apodaca has been linked to a red pickup truck, and one witness apparently saw Beth inside the truck with him 3 days before her disappearance. And since Apodaca lived in New Mexico, it would make sense for him to be driving a truck with out-of-state plates. But here's the big problem. I have seen a photograph of Apodaca, and he does not resemble Claude at all, to say the least. He's a Hispanic man who would have been just over 50 years old at the time Beth went missing, and I see no indication that he ever wore prescription eyeglasses with blue-tinted photograde lenses. Not only was Claude allegedly about 20 years younger than Apodaca, but he was also described as being fair-skinned. Of course, it's certainly possible that Apodaca still did it, and Claude is nothing more than a red herring, and he was just a completely random guy who harassed Beth shortly before she went missing, but had no actual involvement. So it's a weird anomaly in that there seems to be a lot of compelling evidence to suggest that the mysterious man in the pickup truck is responsible for Beth's disappearance, but it also doesn't seem like Apodaca could be that same man. I think it would depend on how much credence you put into the story that Apodaca's former girlfriend drove him out to a remote area and was present when he buried Beth's body. This is the part of the story which causes the most confusion for me, because it may or may not have involved different girlfriends. We have one girlfriend who led police to an alleged burial spot in 1993, though they were unable to uncover Beth's remains. And then we have a second girlfriend, Viola Moya, who was accused of being present when Beth's body was buried and became the subject of a grand jury investigation in 2006. Since the girlfriend from 1993 was never publicly named, was she Viola Moya? this part has never been made clear to me, but if I had to guess, I'm assuming they're not the same person, because if Moya actually confessed to her involvement in Beth's murder in 1993 and led authorities to a supposed burial spot, why would they wait 13 years to try and indict her? When she was publicly named as a suspect in 2006, Moya was quoted as saying, "I have never seen that girl, I know nothing about her," which doesn't sound like someone who tried to help the police recover the victim's body. So does this mean that Apodaca had two different girlfriends who were each accused of helping him cover up a murder? Whatever the case, the grand jury did not feel there was enough evidence to indict Moya and gave a less than flattering assessment of the investigation. They claimed that the jurisdictional disputes and lack of coordination between the different law enforcement agencies who worked this case made it very difficult to corroborate many of the key pieces of information, so that might help explain why there's so much confusion about this. Regardless, just because the grand jury refused to indict Viola Moya does not necessarily mean that she's innocent. They just clearly lack the conclusive evidence that she was involved. Since Apodaca is long dead, I can understand why investigators might have gotten a bit overzealous about wanting to implicate an alleged accomplice, because if Apodaca really did murder Beth, and there are no other living witnesses, recovering her remains might be impossible. Overall, I'd have to say I'm kind of on the fence when it comes to Apodaca's involvement. I think there's good reason to suspect Apodaca, but I think it would depend on how much stock you put into the sightings of Claude, the driver of the red pickup truck. On the basis of how the witnesses described him, it just doesn't seem likely that Claude and Apodaca could be one and the same. But if Claude wasn't actually responsible, then Apodaca seems like the best candidate. So sadly, at the moment, all three of these women are technically still missing people. Two of these cases have a prime suspect who is currently deceased, and one of them I am 99.9% certain was the killer. Even though she's never been found, Paul Rowles was most likely responsible for the disappearance of Tiffany Sessions. There's a promising suspect in Beth Miller's disappearance, though there's more uncertainty about that one, and in Tracy Kroh's case, it sounds like people from her community have their own suspect in mind, but without any concrete evidence, it's nothing more than hearsay at this point. All we know for certain is that Tiffany, Beth, and Tracy were all murdered by someone, and their remains are still out there somewhere. Of course, the main reason I decided to do an episode featuring all three of these cases is because of the bizarre anonymous tip from 1994, which I'm sure everyone now agrees was nothing but nonsense. Nevertheless, I thought this would be a good opportunity to shine a spotlight on each of these cases, because the victims are all still missing and have families who have worked tirelessly to find them and uncover the truth about what happened. They all deserve closure after dealing with these losses for 3 decades now. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearances of Beth Miller, Tiffany Sessions, or Tracy Kroh, please do not call the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children hotline and say they're being held captive together in a prostitution ring. If you have any real information about Beth, please call the Colorado Bureau of Investigations at 303-239-4222. That's 303-239-4222. For Tiffany's case, please call the Alachua County Sheriff's Office at 352-367-4161. That's 352-367-4161. And for Tracy's case, please contact the Pennsylvania State Police at 717-362-8700. That's 717-362-8700. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've already released some exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and we'll be releasing another new one this month, so to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take this moment to give a shout out to our most recent listener who has signed up with us on Patreon, so a big thanks to Pat A. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.